Camilla's son has been removed from Windsor. And the behavior that triggered it was not some minor lapse in judgment. It was the kind of thing that forced William's hand after a period of watching, waiting, and quietly building a case nobody inside the palace saw coming. What the surface coverage completely misses is that this isn't just about one incident. It's about a relationship William had been reassessing for longer than anyone realized.
First of all, 25 years of completely keeping away from royals, full stop.
And a moment so damaging it finally made silence impossible. So what actually happened inside those walls? And what did it reveal that William could no longer ignore? Tom Parker Bowles, food critic, Eton alumnus, stepbrother to the future King of England, and, crucially, the man King Charles himself chose as godson. That last detail is what makes this story explosive. I'm not talking about someone who wandered into palace orbit. I'm talking about a man woven into this family at multiple levels, through his mother's marriage in 2005, through his education at the same school as William and Harry, and through a godfather relationship with Charles that predates all of it. That context is exactly why what happened at Windsor matters. This wasn't a stranger at the gate. This was someone with decades of proximity to the crown, a food critic by trade, a royal insider by circumstance, which is what makes the claim of him being thrown out so combustible. The question isn't just what he allegedly did. The real question is who had the authority to remove him, and whether that person had been quietly building toward this moment far longer than anyone realized. That answer starts with understanding how this family was actually constructed. Now, to understand why William had the authority to do what sources say he did, you first have to understand what this family actually is, structurally, legally, and in terms of raw power. The 2005 marriage between Charles and Camilla created something the British monarchy had genuinely never navigated before. A blended family at the center of the crown, two distinct bloodlines, two completely different inheritance trajectories, and built into that architecture from the very beginning, a tension that sources suggest nobody ever fully resolved. Tom and Laura entered that arrangement as untitled outsiders, Camilla's children, not carrying HRH designations or official royal platforms. They were family by marriage, warmly included in private, carefully kept at arm's length in public. William, meanwhile, was already the future king. His position wasn't a courtesy or a title waiting to be confirmed. It was constitutional, fixed, and he understood that distinction long before anyone ever tested it. That distinction matters enormously here, because what it created wasn't just a social hierarchy. It created a structural fault line. One side of this family holds the succession. The other side holds proximity to it, nothing more. For 19 years, that tension stayed mostly quiet, but it was never resolved. It was simply managed. So when Charles became king in September 2022, the question nobody wanted to ask out loud finally had to be answered. What exactly is Tom and Laura's official standing now? The answer was stark and deliberate. No title, platform, and access. That was the answer, sources say, delivered not through announcement, but through deliberate, structural silence. When Charles was proclaimed king in September 2022, the palace machinery moved quickly. Titles were confirmed, roles were assigned, and positions were quietly locked in. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez received nothing. Sources close to the palace describe this as entirely intentional, the kind of decision that doesn't require a meeting because the outcome was never seriously in question. And here's what makes that significant. Charles is Tom's godfather. The relationship predates everything, and still, the boundary held. Now, William was not a passive observer in this process. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that proximity to the crown cannot become confused with belonging to it. That distinction was one he had been quietly reinforcing for years, not through confrontation, but through access. Who gets it, who doesn't, and who decides? But there's a gap in this picture that matters. Tom's son Freddie served as a page at the 2023 coronation, walking alongside Prince George. That's not the optics of a family being shut out entirely. So what changed? What specifically pushed William from quietly maintaining the boundary to something far more deliberate? That's where the Windsor Gala enters the story. So here's where the story actually shifts from background architecture into something operational, because everything up to this point has been structural. But sources suggest that what happened at Windsor wasn't the product of a slow institutional drift. It was the product of a specific night, a specific list, and a very specific decision made at a very specific time. The event was a high-profile charity gala at Windsor Castle, the kind of evening that looks ceremonial from the outside, formal dress, photographed arrivals. Charles positioned at the center of it all as the symbolic anchor, but sources describe the operational reality of that evening very differently. Charles was the figurehead. William was running the room, and the guest list. Sources suggest it was approved personally by William at 6:04 p.m. the prior evening, approved by William himself, with deliberate attention to every name on it. Now, why does that matter? Because a guest list isn't just logistics. Inside the palace, who gets access to a Windsor event is a statement. It tells you who is considered part of the institution and who is considered adjacent to it. That line William had been quietly drawing for years, but drawing it quietly is one thing. What sources describe happening at that gala is something else entirely, because someone arrived at the gate who wasn't on that list. Someone with a gold-embossed invitation and a very prominent surname, which raises the question that the next part of this story has to answer. If William personally approved that list the evening before and that name wasn't on it, then how exactly did Tom Parker Bowles end up at the gate at all? Tom Parker Bowles arrived at the Windsor Gate carrying a gold-embossed invitation. He announced himself, Camilla's son, stepbrother to the future king, godson of the reigning monarch. By every social calculation available to him, he had standing, he had a name, he had what looked like documentation. His name was not on the list. Sources describe what followed as a 12-minute standoff, not a brief misunderstanding resolved with a phone call. 12 minutes of security personnel, trained under standing orders William had issued weeks before this evening, holding that line without flinching. And that detail is the one that matters most here, because security staff at a Windsor event do not improvise. They do not make judgment calls about whose surname carries enough weight to override a printed list. They operate on instructions, and the instructions they were operating on had been deliberately constructed to be airtight, precisely so that no surname, invitation, and no announcement at the gate could undo them. Now, the gold-embossed invitation raises an obvious question. If William personally approved that guest list at 6:47 p.m. the prior evening and Tom's name was absent, then where did the invitation come from? Who issued it? That question, sources say, does not have a clean answer yet. But the fact that it exists, that Tom arrived holding physical documentation that someone inside the palace apparatus had generated, tells you this confrontation didn't begin at the gate. It began somewhere much closer to the inside. But here is what the standoff itself confirmed. The security team didn't waver. No senior aide came down to negotiate. The boundary held for 12 minutes and then held further. That was not accidental. It was, in the language people inside these institutions understand immediately, a demonstration. What it demonstrated and who had actually made the moment that put Tom at that gate in the first place traces back to a conversation that happened 30 days earlier, a private meeting. A proposal William had already flatly rejected. So how did the invitation exist at all? So here is the question that the gate confrontation itself couldn't answer. Tom Parker Bowles didn't conjure that gold-embossed invitation from nowhere. Someone with access to the palace apparatus generated it deliberately. And sources say the answer to how that happened traces back 30 days to a private meeting at Clarence House that almost nobody was supposed to know about. According to sources close to the situation, Camilla requested that meeting herself. The framing was careful. She presented Tom's attendance at the Windsor Gala as a gesture toward family harmony. A blended family showing unity at a high-profile charitable moment. Nothing provocative, entirely reasonable on the surface. William flatly refused, and sources suggest William's reasoning wasn't personal animus, it was architectural. The boundary between Camilla's bloodline and official Windsor access had been drawn deliberately when Charles became king, and William had no intention of allowing a single charity evening to quietly redraw it. That should have been the end of it. But Camilla didn't treat the refusal as final. She treated it as an obstacle. And somewhere in the 30 days between that Clarence House meeting and the evening of the gala, an invitation was generated anyway. Precise, official-looking, gold-embossed, bearing Tom's name. This is what makes tonight's confrontation something fundamentally different from a scheduling error or a miscommunication. This was a calculated override, Camilla using the machinery of the palace itself to reverse a decision William had already made and communicated directly. The question isn't whether the gambit was audacious. It obviously was. The question is what William did the moment he found out the override had worked, that Tom was already standing at the gate. And here is where the story shifts. Because up until this moment, everything William had done was at a remove. All of it had been conducted through the machinery of the palace. Deliberate, deniable, operationally clean. Sources suggest that was intentional. William had been managing this situation quietly, keeping his fingerprints at a careful distance from anything that could be framed as a personal attack on Camilla's family. But Camilla's override changed the calculation entirely. The moment word reached William inside the gala, he made a decision that nobody near him apparently expected. He didn't send a proxy. He left left the floor. Sources describe William walking through a side corridor, jacket buttoned, moving with the kind of deliberate pace that people who work closely with him have learned to read as controlled anger rather than urgency. He reached the gate himself, personally, and sources describe his jaw visibly tightening as he told security, directly and without ambiguity, that Tom Parker Bowles was not entering under any circumstances. That is not a ceremonial act. That is not something a future king does unless he is genuinely, completely prepared to own the consequences publicly. Sources say the people standing in that corridor understood immediately that something structural had just happened. Not just a guest being turned away, but a line being drawn with William's own presence as the signature on it. Charles, sources suggest, was kept entirely in the dark throughout. The man whose godson was standing at that gate, whose wife had made the invitation, was left on the gala floor while his son resolved the situation without him. That is the real revelation of the evening, not the confrontation at the gate, but what it confirmed about who is actually making decisions, which raises the question everyone inside the palace was quietly asking by the end of the night. What, exactly, was the behavior that made William willing to go that far? It has an answer, and the answer is nothing. Nothing that exists outside the ecosystem of channels repeating the same viral label back to each other. But here is what that gap actually reveals. If the immoral behavior claim collapses under scrutiny, which parts of this story, if any, are actually true? Now, that question deserves a real answer. What is verifiable is real. What surrounds it was built to sound real. So if the specific incident is constructed around real tension, what does that tension actually reveal about who is genuinely running the palace right now? So, if the fabricated label collapses under scrutiny, what remains is the more interesting story, a structural question that sources suggest has been building quietly inside the palace for years. Not who did what at which gate, but who, right now, is genuinely running the operational machinery of the British monarchy. Sources close to the palace frame it this way. Charles holds the title, signs the documents, and sits at the ceremonial center of every public engagement. But the decisions about access, about optics, about who appears on which guest list and under whose authority, those, sources suggest, are increasingly William's domain. That is the structural shift the title gestures toward, even if the specific incident attached to it is constructed. William has quietly accumulated operational control that traditionally took decades to earn. The guest list approval, the security standing orders, the refusal to be overridden even by a direct approach from Camilla herself. Nothing individually constitutes a coronation of power. Everything collectively suggests one has already happened. Charles remains king. But sources suggest that when the machinery needs a decision made quickly, below the ceremonial surface, the answer increasingly runs through William. Which raises the question nobody has answered cleanly. If William genuinely controls that access, who got Tom to the gate in the first place? And that question is the one nobody inside the palace has cleanly answered. Sources suggest the answer points inward, not to Camilla directly. That would be too visible, too traceable, but to someone operating one layer below her, a staff member with daily proximity to the Queen Consort and a loyalty that predates any obligation to William's authority. That person's identity has not been confirmed, and that is precisely the problem. If William genuinely controls palace access the way sources suggest, a rogue invitation issued from inside his own machinery means the perimeter has a gap he hasn't sealed. One staff member, one quiet act of loyalty to the wrong principle. Sources say William knows this. Whether he's found the thread yet is a different question. Whether Camilla intends to pull it again, that answer is still coming. William acted. Tom is out. But the question nobody's asking, what does Charles, Tom's own godfather, do next? This was never just about behavior. It was about who William trusts inside those walls. And that list is getting shorter.